Let's look. I'm going to attach something which comes from Carl Becker and which develops the same theme that Nietzsche is developing in the truth in the uses and abuses of history essay. But do we see here a true, a genuine manifestation of the true God? Or is this something like a prostitute claiming to be God, calling herself God? In Nietzsche, the theme is developed differently, but I think we do get something of the true light and the true stars and the true ocean here in Carl Becker's version, although it appears very dry. But he says, but Sloterdijk is coming out with this book where he's saying on the prince in the age of the ordinary man. So Carl Becker is already writing about this everyman, ordinary man, and he's saying basically what the historians do is basically what we all do just to maintain ourselves in daily life. Because if we in the case of that Memento film, they showed a disorder which they had some guy who had that disorder. So the Memento film was obviously based on an actual case. There's some famous film of him, short film, of him being thrilled to see somebody and then fall back into as though he hadn't seen them in a long time, and then relapse back into his condition, and then once again be sort of, not in a Pan Am way, but in a genuine way, be thrilled by the sight of someone one hasn't encountered in a long time. Even, that could happen even if it's an enemy, for instance, or even if it's somebody one's generally indifferent to, let's say. Probably better example. If you hadn't seen them in 10 years, then you see them, then that's usually accompanied by some sort of enjoyment. And it's spontaneous, right? So that's a kind of an interesting example of what's at stake with spontaneity, with something like spontaneity rather than the. This is sort of at the core in a way of what Agamben's trying to get at with. Say that we superimpose that. Say we superimpose that example over what Agamben's saying about Glenn Gould, where that's a specific form of the metaphysics theta questions of Heidegger, of dunamis and inertia, or of the actuality and the possibility. This question where the Megarians are represented by Aristotle as having mistaken, but just in this zone between the Megarian claim that I guess it's just the same as like to say all these people, Nate Silver and all these guys who come out with tons of statistics on unrepeatable political events. That's the metaphysical equivalent in ordinary events. Like compare that to the roulette wheel, which is predictable and it continuously actually creates a statistical distribution. But trying to throw that over one-time events and then saying something like, oh, we have a sort of big data version of examples, which, however, is only the current set of examples. So black swan could always, hit something like that. That's also the same. So that's also sort of the place where this potential. Here's the what we think the distribution will be. Our estimation, its potential, and actual are set in contrast. And then people say, yes, prediction is possible. No, it's not possible. And the Megarians basically say, no, you can't sensu stricto, no. There's no such thing as this actual wedge to stand on where you really can make a prediction. You're always, in some sense, like a light clicking around from a submarine deep at sea, sort of flashing and hoping for, maybe there'll be a response somewhere. Maybe we'll see something. Maybe we won't crash into the stones. Maybe there's always something. I suppose it's sort of like you have to try. So it's like, of course you are going to try, and then you find, it works in some ways. So is that it works in some ways then become the technology, which is sort of on analogy with handicraft and with originally saddle making, pottery, like vase brisé, whatever. This little tink of Nietzsche's hammer comes down, of the tuning hammer, this light tuning hammer, which senses to see, as we were talking about before, the worths of things. How much worth is this science, the so-called predicting science, with its bell curves and all that apparatus, with its manners of constructing probability expectations? What actually is this object? Why science? Nietzsche's asking. So I think this the Carl Becker version, although it doesn't have sort of all these Nietzschean extremes of sort of harsh juxtapositions of eternal ideas and on the other hand totally sensual imagery to go along with it and make the whole thing something one wants to read about. The Becker one is very dry, but I think he brings out very well how immediate this problem is and how it touches. It's sort of like if you didn't have a habit, then I think it would be sort of like if you didn't have a habit of memory and thinking, and you didn't have a certain little sort of able to direct your agenda through memory, that would be a bit like the good version of Invasion of the Aliens, I think. What's that movie called? Invasion of the Body Snatchers. The Donald Sutherland one, the San Francisco one. Where it's kind of like one thing that makes it so interesting is sort of there's the one lady that manages to fit in, and she says, oh, this is how you act if you just want to pretend to be one of them. And then it's kind of like it's unclear what the thoughts and the ideas of the pod people are. They're living in a certain way. They make certain announcements. I think uh, they came out with the Leonard Nimoy character came out with some statement about what they were making the world better or something. But the way they live, the whole way they live in daily life, would be alien. So like if you suddenly woke up and you didn't have any memory of why people do things in your culture. Like for instance, I had this experience with an African guy who was he would run up and give me like a couple dollars or something, like say, here, take this, and then he would come back like a few weeks later and he'd say, oh, can you lend me some money or something. And so it's like a practice. It's just it's like it's a specific practice that's done in some African countries where it's like you build up a sort of group where you have a sort of a minimal amount of trust where you can kind of create a safety net, something like that. That's how I interpreted it. But we have n number of practices that if you didn't remember like why you were doing them, you would just be, I think, sort of like in that Invasion of the Body Snatcher situation, which is sort of what makes that film interesting. But then the point is, what Becker is really showing is all our agendas of daily life are kind of these Wittgensteinian Sprachspiel, little clusters of things, and they're all mixed together. So it's very difficult to actually engage that thought, I think, and even to know how to weigh it, whether it makes sense or whether there's even any sense to it. And then so we're just trying to kind of open the adventure of attempting to ask that question, I think, which Nietzsche had already lived out, I think, directly, but maybe he in an insane way. Maybe he took it too seriously. Who knows? But to confront that problem, Alcine Anderson seems to be a worthy aspiration, and we should connect that then, that whole field, that whole sort of metonymic congeries of things, we could sort of transfer into the other topic on so one on the Megarian problem, but two on Draco and let's say Oliver Wendell Holmes in his essay on the natural law. So when he discovers that there's this historicism problem and suggests that the jurors should become openly political. That corresponds, I guess, I suppose, to Nietzsche's time, but not to Nietzsche's actual. That corresponds to recognizing the problem Nietzsche's, as it were, inferring more out of and coming to this sort of facing up to in a different way and trying to. I mean, Oliver Wendell Holmes just considers that within the question of legal questions, within the question of appointing judges and stuff like that. He doesn't consider it in metaphysical, philosophical, and even in the terms of people writing history books and how we understand our history. He only looked at it in one of its sort of its perspectival versicolarities. So yeah, I think we could connect up that problem and So I'll put those two. I'll put two things in the notes, but also we should try to think how the problem of conscience or deliberative action, decisions made through deliberative action. I mean, in a way, it's just ish rather than the rest of the Freudian psyche, as it were. It's just to say, here's the conscious agents, and then we're separate, and this is what they think they're acting on, but then there's some kind of libet experiments or something, and they don't know that really the decisive motor spring of their action is wider. It could, so, I mean, it's not I think the right, I think even it's not ultimately right, but right within the horizon of the way these questions are asked. Way to look at it is that, yes, there are differences. There's conscious thinking, dianoia, speech to oneself, and decision making, sort of clicking into that decision. But then there's also reflex actions. There's also other factors. So, and then they're all, you can't really settle it by just looking at, if you try to settle it, libet is very primitive. They'd have way more super advanced stuff on this that for some reason we haven't been hearing that much about it, but I looked into it a number of years ago. It looks like a field that we will hear about at some point, I think. All these questions about how, looking at the brain, you could make specific predictions about what somebody's going to do, something like that, based on the libet claim to know in advance of when the person knew what they were going to do. You have sort of those different registers under sort of some category of sort of epicircle category. Then when you look at all this stuff through this sort of I don't know, from the perspective of people doing libet experiments, Sam Harris or whatever, engineer-minded type of people. But from the point of view of an examination into Draco and OWHolmes, we get instead directed at something more like the spirit of the laws, the legal spirit, as being basically right where the early philosophers were. You still see that later on modified by sort of this little moon drop, like a little 3 drops of water on the tabletop, a little silvery reflection. In Descartes, in the change of the language of objectivity and subjectivity, or really the totally new language, because they say, it's almost the opposite, which really means all bets are off. It's not, it's just nothing like what it used to be. Object, subject totally changed meaning with Descartes, and we still have that. And it's, it doesn't need to be, it doesn't need to be argued how much a role that plays constantly in daily discussion. Subjectivity, objectivity, it's merely subjective what you're saying. It's not according to the facticity, etc. But I think it's, again, this is very small when compared to what Hegel's talking about when he's talking about the emotions of the blind man who has newly come into possession of sight at the beginning of the tradition in the early Greek thinkers.